let's go and talk about how to use Filmist. It doesn't matter if you're shooting Lightroom Capture One, even if you're using LUTs and something like Affinity, or if you're editing video, it's not just a preset pack that we threw together. It's something that's constantly being refined. But why talk when we can be using film on our digital files? Today, we're going to be looking at Lightroom and Capture One, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences as I cover how to get the most out of using Filmist2. The heavy lifting has been done for you in the presets and the corresponding styles for Capture One, so that you can pretty much use them the same in either location. Of course, need to install Filmist. You can see I have Filmist installed right here, and in Lightroom it's pretty easy. You can bring in the zip file that you extracted from the main zip download of Filmist. In Capture One, you can just open the styles pack. But if you need any help installing Filmist in Capture One, in Lightroom, LUTs, in Photoshop, whatever it is you're using, go to simfx.com/help, and there's videos that cover each one of these. When you come into Filmist, you're going to see three essential categories. The first is ChemKit 2. This is kept fairly minimal, but it's incredibly powerful, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. Now we go to the Start Films. This 0 preset will reset your film to 0. It won't reset your crop, lens corrections, and things like that, but what it will do is it will take away all the develop settings that correspond to that. And it works the same in Capture One. Then we start with all our true films. So you can scroll through and find whatever film works best for what you're using. And then it goes down to the silver films. These are also true film presets based on real films. And then down at the bottom, we have the X experimental film. Don't ignore these. Sometimes they're not as exciting because they don't represent an exact true film. But most of these are variants or what ifs from other films, and some of them give really beautiful results in a lot of situations. Now let's take this one. This is a raw file, and I'm just going to go through and do something like an Ektar. All the films in Filmist are designed to be controlled by a mount, so you can turn that up or down. At 100 or standard, when you apply the preset, that should give you what that film looks like if you were shooting the real film. But if you feel like it's a little too much, you can turn it down, you can turn it up if you want to go a little bit more intense. As you're using film emulations on your digital files, there's a really important thing to remember. While I spend endless hours refining these, and you can see from the demos that I've showed you that I'm doing a lot of testing. If you look on the left here, we have an actual scan of Portra 400, and on the right, we have the Portra 400 Gen 3 from Filmist. But the problem I run into in creating true film looks is different lighting conditions change the way the film responds. The way the scans are change the way the film responds. So then I even go to making darkroom prints and contact sheets and trying to get as natural as possible to refine the films even more that are still available to us. Even that is an imperfect science. Even the paper you use in the darkroom, the way you adjust the color adjustments in the enlarger, yes, it's not straight through. When you're printing in a color enlarger, they're using color filters to balance it out because the film is locked in for a specific daylight white balance in the case of a daylight film. But that daylight white balance, as I'm sure you've noticed if you've looked at the white balance on your digital files, isn't always the same. So how does this convert to getting real film looks? It's okay that sometimes there's slight variables. Even if you're shooting real rolls of film, developing yourself in the darkroom, using consistent processes, you're going to get different results in film from batch to batch. But the characteristics, the nuances, and the beauty should be retained. Most film presets come in and they still kind of have that overdriven, harsh digital look. With Filmist, you're going to be able to retain those natural looks really well. You can use it on JPEGs, you can use it on RAW files, but of course, RAW files are going to give you the most natural, true to film results because there's no filter applied to them in advance. So I could come in and do Portra 800. I could do an Ektar look, which looks really good here. The Fuji Pro 400H looks really nice. And then I could adjust it and turn it up and down. But you might look at this and say, wait a minute, it seems a little bit too red for Fuji 400H. The difference you're seeing there is just the slight nuances and characteristics that you get in every digital file as well. If you apply a look and you're like, hey, that seems to have a little bit too much magenta, it's probably in your white balance. And don't be afraid just to adjust it a little bit. to add a little bit of warmth. This is no different than if you're in the darkroom doing gorgeous prints and you're making slight adjustments, doing test strips, and figuring out exactly how from this shoot you want to print that film. When I send a free update in Filmist, you do want to update. Sometimes the tweaks on these films truly are single point adjustments as I adjust for colors and do testing, but the films get better each time. And that's why Filmist has become so natural. That's why I can go out and I can put a roll of Portra 400 in my Olympus OM2 and I can shoot that, and I can shoot the X-T3 or the Sony side by side, and I can edit those side by side and get the same aesthetic out of both of them. I'm always testing. I'm always experimenting, all the way down to things like taking out a Polaroid and seeing how that black and white look translates to digital. And you'll see that SX70 look that is based on actual SX70 test images to give that contrasty lo-fi Polaroid look. Okay, so this is simple enough. Whether you're in Lightroom or Capture One, you go through, you choose your film, and really probably the only things you're going to need to change is maybe touch up your white balance a little bit if you feel it's a little too warm, a little too cool. We all have different preferences, and don't worry about using an exact gray card for this. If you've seen my videos on white balance, as long as you're shooting raw, you're retaining all the information. White balance to the look that you're trying to create, not to what a computer tells you it should be. Just like the meters in our camera shouldn't be relied on entirely to decide what our exposure should be. These are things I talk about a lot in my Shadow Hackers workshop, so check out those if you've never been to one. You're going to find your own favorites in Filmist, and you're going to find the classics like the Portras, the Ektars, the Fujis, and then you're even going to find things like the classic Neg, the classic Chrome. These are favorites. Every film has been updated in Filmist 2, and we have more Gen 2, we have now Gen 3s, but there's also new films. Like I've done more with Cine films, and so you can do Vision 250, you can do Eterna. Now this Eterna here is actually based on the real Eterna stock, not just the Eterna that's often talked about from Fuji cameras. You can get the Cine S400 look, and this is also very powerful. Every film interprets colors a little differently. It has warmer or cooler tones, and you're going to find this to your advantage. In fact, you're probably going to use things like white balance less than ever. If I use Cine S400, you can see it's a very warm stock, but if I go to something like Eterna, it's a lot cooler. Vision is somewhere in between. In Filmist 2, there's so many ways that you can edit a photo, and all of them will give you a result that's natural and has that organic film feel. But you have choices as well. But now let's talk about mods, because just like in a real darkroom where you can adjust your contrast and your pushing and your pulling and use different papers and get different tones and hues and warmths, you can do all of that in Filmist also. Let's say I come to this portrait and we kind of have this on the face sunset light. There's definitely some reddishness to this. One of the reasons digital fails so often to have that kind of filmic look, especially on portraits, is oranges. If we take this and we go to something like Portra 800, it has a pretty intense look. And there's just something about the way digital handles certain color tones that film responds to differently. But in the latest update, I created a solution for this in the digital orange fixer. This is another one of those hand-coded presets, and what it does is it only affects that orange channel, which allows us to get those really nice, subtle film-like skin tones back. Now, of course, you can still go down here and tweak with channels, you can tweak with saturation, but what this does is it leaves the color nuances of the film alone and just allows you to quickly correct that. You only need this if you feel like one of the presets isn't responding in the filmic way you expected. For example, if I take this same photo and I go to Portra 160, it looks soft and beautiful out of the gate just because of the way it renders those colors. Now, all my preset packs have mods, whether it's Streetist or Silver or Natural HDR, but the mods in Filmist are special because ChemKit mods and now ChemKit 2 are all designed around concepts related to getting a darkroom-like look. So if I want a bit more softness, I can turn on the microfilmic bloom. I can go over here to the right and use exposure just fine and adjust and mod. But in Filmist 2, you're going to find push and pull tools that are much more designed based on darkroom concept. Instead of using the exposure slider, I'm actually going to use the develop push. And you'll notice here that this pushes the exposure, but it didn't touch the exposure slider. And I can now turn this up or down. The advantage is that the tools here are designed to affect contrast and shadow and tone, much like you would get by doing those processes on film, in the darkroom, in the wet baths. So this is more or less a one-stop push, but now I can adjust this using the amount slider, or in Capture One, I can use the opacity sliders. So let's go to another example. Let's go through and find a film stock that I really like on this, and I'm going to do something like Ektar. I think Ektar 100 looks really good here, although Ektar 1000, though we can't get it anymore, is actually a really cool stock as well. But I'm going to stick with the Ektar 100. Now I might say, okay, this is a little bit flat. You'll see another push and pull tool, and that's the pull and push with ISO contrast. So if I push the ISO contrast, you can see that I'm getting this very contrasty look. It's affecting the shadows, it's affecting the highlights, and I can turn it up and down. If I had an image that was too contrasty, I could do the reverse and flatten it out more, and I could decide how far I wanted to go on that. In this case, I'm going to push a little bit, but I'm going to dial it back on the opacity just a little bit. So what's happening here is when you push and pull real film in the camera, you do it, for example, to get a higher ISO. You might take a 100 speed film and push it 2 stops to 400. When you do that, you do get more exposure, but with it, you get a different pattern of contrast. You tend to increase the contrast, the highlights, the blacks are more intense. So the ISO push tool is actually mimicking that. If you pull, you're going the other way. So if you had a 400 speed film and you shot it at 100, you're pulling the film, shooting it at a lower ISO, and with that, you actually get less contrast, which can be good in certain situations for grain, for dynamic range, things like that. So apply your film stock first, then come up to your mods and say, hey, I want to push, I want to pull. Most of the films in Filmist have a moderate grain that represents the ISO, but obviously our ISOs are different if we're shooting medium format, if we're shooting 35 millimeter, etc. So you can control how much grain you have with the mod presets as well. I could do the high ISO mod and add more ISO, or I could do the low ISO mod, but with either of these, I can then control the opacity up or down. So if I do the high ISO mod and then turn it up, well, I'm going to get more grain coming into this. Or if I want to go down, I can actually bring it all the way down to 0, and now I have no grain at all. But some of them, like the push and pull mods, do very complex things. In fact, the ISO mod presets in Lightroom and Capture One, I have to manually hand edit the coding of those files so it only affects sliders that are relevant to what they're supposed to adjust. And that way, those presets, as you're pushing and pulling, don't change the color curves, for example, of your Ektar or your Portra. Whatever it is you shoot, Filmist is just going to work. Let's come in here and do something like Provia 400. And I could adjust it a little bit, but I might say, hey, I want a little more dynamic range. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with coming over and tweaking your shadow and highlights a bit more, but you could also use something like the tone mastering bath. Let's apply these masks and then we can turn them up and down. And what you're going to notice in ChemKit is the way tonal response is designed to be very filmic, natural, and organic. Now we can go over to the masks here and we can see that this put a highlight compressor and a shadow compressor on, and we can of course adjust those individually as well. And yes, let's just look at Capture One a little bit because it works the same. And you can come in and apply the same films in the same way from right up here in the styles panel. You can see I have Filmist2 installed. You have all the mods. In fact, we even have the AI film retouching masks that are great for portraits and skin tones and things like that, because the latest versions of Capture One now have AI masking. If I'm in Lightroom and I want to do more, I'll go to my Elegant Speed Mask Pack, which kind of takes that to a whole different level, and there's all kinds of AI masking and things like that. But you'll always see that AI film retouch, that filmic AI mask in Filmist, so that you can quickly get that retouched look and maintain the Filmist nuance. I actually love Agfa RSX. The Agfa series films are actually not talked about much, but they are some of my favorites. Now in Capture One, you'll find the similar tools, and the layer system works a little bit differently in Capture One. Don't be afraid to play around with the different films, as well as tweak your white balance and your settings a little bit to get exactly what you want. Now don't forget, you can right click on a preset and apply it to a new layer, and then you can of course adjust the opacity and details of it from within there as well if you want to stack them up. If you want to put a mod preset, for example, on one layer so that it's adjustable, you could do all that within Capture One. Just like in Lightroom, start with your main film and then adjust it as needed. Now, I should mention that you should go up to the three dots, the settings of the styles panel, and make sure that you turn on stack styles. Make sure this is checked, because if you do not, what will happen is when you go to your mods, they will overwrite the entire style versus just adding the settings that it adjusts on top of it. At the end of the day, if you dig into what each preset is doing, the color tools work slightly differently. The sliders might have slightly different names, but ultimately you're going to get the same beautiful results whether you're working in Capture One or in Lightroom. Now, it's important to remember that Filmist also includes LUTs. LUTs are sort of like a universal preset, so you can use them in video editors like Premiere and Resolve. I'm actually using a LUT on this video right now, but you can also extend those into other apps like Affinity Photo, like On One, and other RAW editors that support LUTs. In fact, you can see right here as I'm prepping for today's video in DaVinci Resolve, I have my video here and I have my LUTs installed here in Resolve, and I can actually just go through. I actually use Kodachrome 64 on a lot of this video, but you can see that we can switch it around and get all the Filmist looks exactly the way we want. And of course, you can then control the opacity, the intensity, things like that of your LUT. They're actually really amazing. So to recap, how to jump in and get the most true film looks out of Filmist: just try things. Apply those presets, get the looks that work best for you, and add those mods. Use things like the AI Film Retouch tool. Remember that whatever the last preset you applied, you're in Lightroom going to have that amount slider where you can turn it up and down. So if I put the Film Retouch tool on, I may not want it to be super intense. I want to maintain that natural look. I might turn it down to 60 or 70% and just balance that out really nicely. That's the power of getting in and using the grounding beauty that is film in our digital edits. That's the power of true film and Filmist2 and the mods and everything. If you have questions, throw them in the comments. I'll be making more videos on how to use Filmist, but I wanted to give you this overview today so you can really dig in. Filmist is a toolkit that has years of research and study behind it, and that costs less than a few rolls of film. This is a pack that I'm sure, like me, you're going to be coming back to constantly, and it's going to become your go-to toolkit for editing your digital files. I'm Gavin Syme. Let me know if you have questions. Hit that like and that subscribe button, and we will see you next time.